This is Alan Naiman from Washington State. He was a social worker who made about $67,000 a year. He fixed his own shoes with duct tape and drove a car most people would have scrapped years earlier. But when he died, he left $11 million to children's charities. If you're wondering how it happened, it's not exactly the story you think it is. Alan worked for Washington's Department of Social Health and Services as a social worker for about 2 decades, and before that, he had been a banker. He never married, never had kids of his own, but he fostered children, and for years he took care of his brother Daniel, who had developmental disabilities. By almost every account from people who knew him, saving money wasn't a sacrifice for Alan. It was like a hobby or a game that he quietly was playing in the background of an otherwise ordinary life. To understand how Alan did what he did or why he made the decisions he did, and how he lived the way he did, you have to go back to before the banking career, before the social work, to his childhood and look at how he grew up. Alan was raised by parents who were quite wealthy, and whether or not Alan learned financial literacy from them is unclear. But one thing that is certain is that his parents would have a major impact on his net worth later in life. He also had an older brother named Daniel who had developmental disabilities, and according to a close friend of Alan's, growing up with Daniel shaped how Alan saw the world from an early age. It definitely contributed to the kind of person Alan grew up to be, and is why decades later he chose to become a foster parent and spent the final months of his life specifically researching charities for disabled and vulnerable kids. The way things played out weren't a random string of events. They traced straight back to the components and people that influenced his childhood the most. Here are some details about Alan's early life. Things like exactly where he was born and what his parents did for a living aren't part of the public record. What we do know is that Alan grew up looking up to role models like Warren Buffett, which may have led his decision to build a career in banking. And somewhere along the way, he became the kind of person who could set up their own investment portfolio to lead him to sit on a fortune for decades without anyone around him having a clue. The kind of person who spends a career in banking and then quietly and patiently compounds an inheritance for 20 years clearly is not operating on luck alone. That's the mindset of someone who studied how long-term, unglamorous investing actually works. The kind of philosophy people associate with investors like Warren Buffett. Buy quality, hold it, let time do the work, and don't spend it just because you can or want to. So let's actually look at the math here, because this is the part most articles about Alan skip completely. I want to show you what it likely looked like for Alan to live and save month to month. Now, an important caveat here before I go any further is that no one has ever published Alan's actual bank statements or exact budget. What I'm about to walk through is a reasonable reconstruction based on his salary, his known frugal habits, and historical cost data for the Washington State during the years he worked there. Think of this as what it would have taken or how you could replicate Alan's financial decisions rather than his literal budget planner or spreadsheet. Alan's salary was around $67,000 a year. After taxes, that's roughly $4,200 to $4,500 a month, depending on the year. The numbers and expenses I'm about to go over likely fluctuated over time due to pay increases and inflation, but I'm just going to look at the median numbers over the time period of the 2010s. Living expenses are generally the largest cost for most people, and we don't exactly know if Alan rented or owned his home. If he was renting during his working years in the Seattle area, market rate would have put him somewhere around $1,200 to $1,800 a month by the 2010s, as Seattle rents climbed hard during the tech boom. However, if he owned his home outright, the numbers would be quite different. Buying a home and paying for it in full isn't financially possible for most people making less than $70,000 a year. But for Alan, it was possible, especially after his father's death, which I'll get into later. This would essentially make the expense of rent or mortgage payments completely disappear. For this estimate, given what we know about Alan's humble spending habits and lifestyle, I'm going to assume he bought a modest, fully paid off home for himself. This would mean his living expenses were slim to none, which is safe to assume because everything we know about how he lived points to that direction. Food, given a duct tape your shoes lifestyle, let's call it $200 to $300 a month in the 2010s. For his vehicle, he mostly drove old, cheap cars with, again, likely no monthly payments because he probably bought them outright. With minimal insurance and gas, we'll call it $150 a month, all in. Basic utilities, phone, incidentals were probably around $200 to $300 a month. Add it all up, and taking into consideration a genuinely frugal version of Alan's monthly expenses, he likely landed somewhere around $800 to $1,200 a month, a fraction of what most people in his income bracket would have spent. That means he could have plausibly been saving and investing somewhere in the range of $3,000 to $3,500 a month, every single month for roughly 20 years. Now here's where a lot of articles about Alan Naiman are going to tell you he saved his way to $11 million on a social worker's salary. And I don't think that's actually true, or at least not the whole story. If we do a stress test to check the numbers, $3,000 a month invested consistently in something like an index fund, averaging historical stock market returns, compounding for 20 to 25 years, gets you somewhere in the neighborhood of $1 to $3 million, which is genuinely incredible for someone on that salary. Life-changing money for sure, and something most people making that salary could replicate if they practiced strong financial discipline like Alan. But it's not $11 million, so where did the rest of the money come from? The reporting on Alan's life mentioned something that a lot of headlines leave out of the title. He inherited millions of dollars from his parents, and that's the piece that actually closes the gap. Take a disciplined 2-decade investing habit on top of a real inheritance, on top of compound growth over enough years, and $11 million stops being unbelievable and starts being genuinely plausible. I don't have a confirmed number for exactly how the inheritance broke down between Alan and Daniel. What is confirmed is that it was substantial, at least 7 figures, which he likely also invested and grew, given what we know about his financial habits. And that inheritance, combined with decades of his own savings and investing, is enough to get him to $11 million. I actually think this makes Alan's story better, not worse, because the headline version, social worker saves $11 million on a normal salary, makes it sound like it was pure willpower. The real version is much more interesting and useful. It shows us that disciplined savings turned an already meaningful inheritance into something enormous, instead of letting it slowly disappear the way inherited money so often does. Here's another piece of the story that makes his story different from the typical frugal millionaire story. Alan didn't leave his money to family. He spent his final months after his cancer diagnosis researching children's charities, organizations that support foster kids, kids with disabilities, and kids in crisis. You may be thinking that Alan's story is very noble and selfless, but life is meant to be enjoyed and lived, and sometimes splurging on yourself and spending some extra cash is okay, or even needed sometimes. Well, Alan did that at least once. The one real splurge in Alan's adult life, as far as anyone's reported, was a sports car, a Scion FRS, I hope I pronounced that right, that he bought after his brother Daniel passed away in 2013. But that's it. That's the one thing he splurged on in his otherwise financially disciplined lifestyle. He never overdid it with his spending. So what do we actually take away from this? Not live on duct tape shoes and you'll die a secret millionaire. I don't think that's the lesson, and I don't think Alan would have wanted it to be. The real lesson is about what happens when you combine 3 things: a genuinely low cost of living relative to income, consistent long-term investing instead of letting money sit or slowly leak away, and enough time for compound growth to do the heavy lifting. Alan didn't get rich from one big decision. He got rich from about 2 decades of small, boring, consistent decisions that most people don't have the patience for, plus the discipline to not spend an inheritance that a lot of people would have burned through in a few years. And then at the end, he gave nearly all of it away to kids he's never met. Alan Naiman isn't famous. There's no biopic, no best-selling book. This was a guy who fixed his own cars and drove a car nobody envied. And that's how he quietly built a fortune that he had zero interest in keeping for himself. If you want me to break down more stories like this, real people, real numbers, real decisions, let me know in the comments. And if this is the kind of channel you want more of, subscribe because I've got more videos like this coming.